What is the nature of time? His later years already blind. Borges declared, "My soul is aflame because I want to know what time is." 1500 years earlier, St. Augustine had replied, "Time, if you don't ask me, I know. If you ask me, I no longer understand. Is time objectively real? Then, why does everyone experience it so differently? Why does even the same person experience time differently across situations? Why do some believe time doesn't exist at all? That there is only a sequence of events?" This video explores humanity's quest to understand time. We'll begin in ancient Greece, traverse more than 2 millennia to reach Einstein, and then venture beyond Einstein to probe the deep questions of time and existence, life and freedom. We'll encounter more than a dozen thinkers along the way. This video builds as it goes. The Einstein section, I'll even explain in detail how he unified time and space. So then, let's begin. The ancient Greeks' exploration of time naturally began with mythology. The name of Zeus's father, Kronos, literally means time. Kronos castrated his own father, the sky god Uranus, with a great sickle to establish his rule. Quite the display of filial piety. The myth of Kronos becoming king foreshadowed the beginning of time itself. Before discussing Aristotle, let's briefly cover his predecessors, Zeno and Plato. Zeno was a famous contrarian who loved stirring up trouble. He ultimately met a violent end, thrown into a large mortar by a tyrant and pounded to death with a pestle. Zeno was the first to directly attack our everyday experience of time. He seized upon the question of whether space and time are infinitely divisible, and proposed 4 paradoxes, arguing from both sides for the contradictory nature of time. Take the dichotomy paradox. Someone wants to traverse a distance. They must first cover half of it. To cover that half, they must first cover half of the half, and then half of that half? Space and time can be infinitely divided. This process continues infinitely. You would need infinite steps to traverse any distance at all, making motion impossible. But what if space and time have minimal units and cannot be infinitely divided? Consider the arrow paradox. Take 2 adjacent minimal units of time, t1 and t2. For the instant t1, the arrow is motionless. Just like in movies and games, if you extract a single frame, it won't show movement. At each of countless instants, there is no motion between 2 instants. Since an instant is already the indivisible minimal unit, there is nothing between them. So where is the motion? This is the arrow paradox. Neither argument works. Time seems to be merely an illusion. Zeno wasn't simply being destructive. He served his teacher Parmenides and the Eleatic school. Their purpose was to seek an essence beyond time. The ancient Greeks were unsatisfied with the ever-changing world of phenomena. They wanted to find a stable, unified, and certain foundation. If the foundation isn't solid, everything shakes. But time is too tricky. It seems all-encompassing, which means any foundation would also exist within time. This means the entire phenomenal world is just leaves drifting on the river of time. Parmenides couldn't accept this. His solution was to divide the world in 2. First, the phenomenal world we can see, touch, and experience. This world exists in time, constantly arising and perishing, both existing and not existing, subject to the suffering of endless cycles. Second, the world outside time, eternal, unchanging, and immortal. The world of truth, transcendent, yet accessible through reason. So Zeno's paradoxes actually aim to break free from the flow of time and direct our minds toward the trans-temporal world of truth. This division into 2 worlds became the basic structure of classical Western philosophy. Pattern we'll see repeated throughout history. Plato inherited this 2-world division, but he clarified the relationship between the phenomenal world and the world of forms. In his famous allegory of the cave, Plato said, "We are like people confined underground. What we see is not reality, but only the shadows cast on the cave wall by things outside." Similarly, the unreality of the material world lies in it being merely an image and imitation of the world of forms. Time, as the order of the material world, is only an imitation of trans-temporal eternity. Time signifies aging, decay, and constant flux. Time is merely the shadow of eternity. Yet time is nevertheless superior to space, because time causes celestial bodies to move according to numerical proportions, thereby creating celestial order. Therefore, time is rational, which makes it superior to space. Remember this phrase, numerical proportions. It would have an important influence on Aristotle. Compared to his teacher Plato, Aristotle was more of a natural scientist. He pointed out that our perception of time's passage and our perception of motion are inseparable. Without motion, there is no time. Time is the cause of motion and change, while motion is the condition for understanding time. In his Physics, Aristotle transformed the question, what is time, into what is the relationship between time and motion? He first refuted earlier views that time is simply the motion of celestial bodies. He pointed out that if this were true, since celestial motion is cyclical, time would also be cyclical, and we should experience identical springs every year. Which is obviously incorrect. So what was Aristotle's own answer? He defined time as the measurement of motion with respect to before and after. This definition has at least two implications. Time pervades and manifests in all motion. Time is associated with motion. Through the mathematical activity of measurement, this allows us both to measure the quantity of motion and change through time, and to measure the length of time through motion. We still use this way of thinking today, whether it's hourglasses, sundials, clocks, Earth's orbital motion, and circadian rhythms. We observe time through spatialized motion. But here's the problem. What appears to us in this way is only spatialized time. This problem, after lying dormant for 2,000 years, would explosively resurface in the 20th century. But let's set that aside for now. Critics of Aristotle's view of time were numerous. Plotinus, representative of Neoplatonism, believed that Aristotle actually evaded the question, ultimately failing to tell us what the nature of time really is. For the ancient Greeks, time was not a question of first principles, but a physics problem. Metaphysics fundamentally sought to exclude time as physics and pursue eternity instead, treating time merely as a physical flow external to humanity. From Aristotle to Newton, time became increasingly abstract and mathematical. In this process, Augustine's appearance was a historical exception. The Middle Ages was an era dominated by Christianity, where philosophy was subordinated to theology, or rather, theology was true philosophy, because God was the ultimate truth. Against this background, some clergy developed a new philosophical school, patristic philosophy. Augustine was its greatest representative. In his youth, he indulged in sensual pleasures, causing his mother endless tears. Later, he converted to Christianity, reformed himself completely, and wrote the famous Confessions. As a theologian, Augustine's inquiry into time naturally started from God. This created immediate problems. For Plato, the creator imitated the eternal world of forms to create the illusory phenomenal world, whose illusoriness lay in having to endure decay in the flow of time. But this worldview couldn't connect with Augustine's theology. He couldn't accept that the phenomenal world created by God was actually false, because God is wholly good and cannot deceive us. Moreover, if God created all things, why would he let them wear down and decay in the flow of time? More seriously, is God within time? If so, that means God is also subject to time's limitations, making him neither eternal nor free, unacceptable. But even if God is outside time, the problem remains. God is outside time. How does he guarantee omniscience of the world within time? The only explanation Augustine could find was that God already foreknew in his will everything that would occur in time. But if so, why bother creating time at all? Augustine believed that since ancient Greece, the reason time has always been such a thorny problem stems from time being treated merely as a ready-made external physical flow. This makes life, freedom, and love completely incomprehensible through the lens of time. Let me digress briefly. What most people understand as objectivity is actually merely externality, an external, detached, contemplative attitude toward things. How do we achieve objectivity? By filtering out all subjectivity. Back to the point. In Augustine's view, the paradox of time demonstrates that seeking time's essence externally is doomed to fail. So what can time be? It can only be the extension of thought. Thus, he initiated the process of internalizing time. And in this sense, Augustine was a precursor to Kantian philosophy. The most intriguing aspect of the temporal phenomenon is probably the distinction between past, present, and future. This sharp division actually obscures their internal connection. The traditional view of time sees it as a constantly passing sequence of present moments, like the playhead on a video progress bar continuously sliding across the screen. To the left of the playhead is the past that has already passed. To the right is the future that hasn't yet been, but will inevitably be past. The past becomes something that has completely flowed away, leaving no trace, while the future becomes something falling from the sky. This view of time easily leads to a sense of life's meaninglessness. Augustine believed we should use the present to activate time's meaning. The traditional threefold division should be changed to the present of past things, the present of present things, the present of future things. This way, each segment of time has an internal connection. The past doesn't disappear without a trace, but remains as images preserved in our memory. My entire past life extends through memory into the present moment, and is intimately related to it, thus giving meaning to our present life. Similarly, we can stand in the present and anticipate the future, opening up future possibilities and planning our present actions. So what is the present? Following Augustine's line of thought, the present is nothing other than immediate thought and consciousness, our temporal experience in each moment. Thus, starting from the living present, past time manifests as memory. Future time manifests as expectation. Present time is consciousness. The unity and extension of thought gives past, present, and future an indivisible wholeness. They coexist in present thought. This was a fundamental breakthrough from the kind of time as physical flow that had prevailed since ancient Greece. Augustine made time into a kind of internal time, which directly inverted the relationship between time and motion. No longer is motion prior to time. Rather, time is prior to motion. Traditional physical time can only be manifested and understood through motion, making motion the prerequisite for understanding time. Therefore, physical time is always dependent on motion. As Aristotle said, time is the measurement of motion. Even in Plato, time is celestial motion. But for Augustine's internal time, time is the prerequisite for understanding motion. For example, how do I confirm that the me climbing out of bed in the morning and the me going out for breakfast are the same person? How do I even know that the me who fell asleep yesterday and the me who woke up today are the same? Because of time. Time organizes these fragments into a whole. Only when the same object displays different spatiotemporal states do we know motion has occurred. Time provides unity to objects undergoing motion and change. Thus, we say, this kind of internal time becomes the prerequisite for understanding motion. Regrettably, Augustine's view of time received little attention until more than 1,000 years later, when his intellectual resources were reactivated in Kant, truly a lonely fate. Both internalized time. But Augustine's original intention was to safeguard God's absolute freedom, while Kant's purpose was to defend human freedom, dignity, and rights. But before that, we must follow historical sequence and arrive at Newton's absolute time. In Newton, absolute time, absolute space, and absolute motion must inevitably be discussed together. Einstein proposed relativity, but much earlier, people had already been using the principle of relativity. All motion is always motion relative to something. That is, we need a concrete frame of reference, concrete spatiotemporal conditions to recognize motion. But Newton wanted to ask, can we have an absolute frame of reference? No wonder Sir Newton's main occupation was actually as a theologian. His answer was not only yes, but that this absolute space is God's sensorium, the infinite arena, where he performs cognition and control. Absolute space is God's omnipresence. Absolute time is God's eternal duration. Newton's absolute space-time view was not only a theological pursuit, but also the logical result of mathematics. This starts with Galileo. Galileo inherited a fundamental belief about the world from Pythagoras through Plato, that mathematics is the most fundamental way to understand the world. The Academy's motto, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter," indicated that such a person lacked the capacity to pursue wisdom. Furthermore, Galileo viewed nature as a very simple, orderly system where every process is completely regular and absolutely necessary. The science studying nature is the same. Laws exist in themselves, completely indifferent to whether humans can understand them. Such a worldview made mathematics, which likewise follows simplicity and necessity, the natural language of nature. This actually became the zeitgeist of that era. From Copernicus to Newton, all used mathematical tools to analyze celestial and indeed all changes. But Galileo first suggested treating time as a mathematical coordinate. Time was now surging forward on the road to further abstraction. Here, we understand that time's absolutization and mathematization are actually two aspects of the same historical process. On the road to Newton, Barrow was a quite crucial figure, foreshadowing time, basically becoming a dimension on a mathematical coordinate system. Barrow believed that human sensory judgments about the world are too vague and difficult to determine. Therefore, sensory judgments must be reduced to numerical representations before we can say our knowledge is valid. Barrow abstracted time from our perception of time, even from motion itself, turning it into an external self-existent dimension on a coordinate system, directly using time as a mathematical tool to analyze objects' motion. Newton's views of time, mathematics, and even theology largely derived from Barrow. In Newton's view, our different methods of measuring time often lead to different results. Even measuring multiple times with the same method produces different results. There is error. In daily life, people consciously or unconsciously ignore the existence of error. But from the perspective of mathematics and theology, there should naturally exist a time to serve as a standard against which to judge those erroneous times. This is absolute time. Continuously improving the precision of time measurement is meaningful. Then absolute time obviously exists. In that godlike work, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, Newton divided time into two: absolute, true, and mathematical time of itself, and from its own nature, flows equably without relation to anything external, and may also be called duration. Relative, apparent, and common time is some sensible and external measure of duration by means of motion, which is commonly used instead of true time. In Newton, true time was thoroughly declared a self-existent existence whose nature is unrelated to any external thing. He believed we can completely imagine a time without things and motion, in which time manifests as pure passage. Time was understood as an existence arranged linearly like a number line. Different times are just different number lines. And like number lines, time has no starting or ending point, but extends in both directions toward infinity. Who deserves such time? Only God deserves it. For absolute space, Newton actually provided proof, the famous bucket experiment. We need to understand Newton's problem awareness first. We learned in middle school that all motion is always motion relative to something, and that rest and uniform rectilinear motion are equivalent. That's why you don't feel yourself speeding when riding a high-speed train. This means we actually cannot perceive the existence of motion and velocity. You can only perceive changes in state of motion. Either velocity changes or direction changes, both producing acceleration. Otherwise, motion and rest are equivalent. As a 21st century person, we immediately think of Einstein's genius insight. Gravity and acceleration are equivalent. But Sir Newton couldn't figure this out. Why is change in state of motion so special? What is its internal meaning? Can we distinguish between rest and motion itself? To understand this, Newton designed his bucket experiment. Imagine, we fill a bucket with water, hang it with a rope, twist the rope tight, and let go. As the rope returns to its original state, it drives the bucket's rotation. Initially, the water in the bucket is still. But as the bucket spins faster, the bucket's motion transfers to the water through friction, making the water rotate too. The water forms a small vortex with a concave center. Here's the question. When the water's velocity equals the bucket's rotational velocity, what is the water rotating relative to? The bucket. But their velocities are the same. Shouldn't they be relatively at rest? Is the water at rest? Impossible, because the water surface is concave, indicating it's definitely not in a rest state. Perhaps you can only say it's relative to Earth or something else external to the water bucket system. Fine, Newton goes further. Imagine we repeat this experiment in a void. Now, besides this bucket apparatus, there's nothing. We twist the rope tight again, let go, and let the bucket spin once more. Logically, we'll still reach the same conclusion. So now, what is the water moving relative to? Newton reveals his answer. It can only be that absolute container, absolute space. Therefore, there exists absolute motion, namely motion relative to absolute space. This thought experiment gave the discussion of absolute space concrete evidence beyond pure speculation, successfully forcing the leader of the relativist camp, Leibniz, to bow to Newton. In the Einstein chapter, we'll return to this bucket experiment. Newton's absolute motion wasn't entirely opposed to relative motion, was just based on this mechanistic cosmology belief. Objects change their spatial relationships with such precision that our frame of reference cannot be arbitrary. There must be a most precise, most superior absolute frame of reference. Who this reference frame is need not be repeated. The mechanistic cosmos always has this abstraction, just as mechanically understanding humans always prefers abstract human nature. In this mechanistic cosmos, there's no place for humanity. Newton's absolute time and absolute space were both meant to explain motion, but his theory was actually full of difficulties, ambiguities, and assumptions without direct observation or definition. Absolute spacetime was meant to explain absolute motion. Yet Newton hoped we could infer absolute motion from certain properties of celestial bodies, and thereby know the absolute spacetime implied by absolute motion. This creates endless tension, but Newton could always throw problems to God. At least God definitely knows whether a given motion is absolute or relative, and he can provide a basic reference center. So when Newton's worldview was gradually stripped of religious associations in the 18th century, the ultimate rationale supporting absolute spacetime also disappeared, and they became increasingly hollow. In my view, Kant's philosophy responded to at least two problems of his age. Problem 1. 18th century mechanical materialism reduced humans to purely natural objects represented by Lemaitrie's man, a machine. Are such humans still human? Problem 2. Over in David Hume's philosophy, humans were fine, but nothing beyond humans remained. These two problems were actually the opposition of two principles, the principle of nature and the principle of humanity, ultimately leading to extreme opposition between nature without humanity and humanity without nature. Kant sought to find a bridge between humanity and nature again. In Kant's view, after Hume's skepticism, the previous dogmatic philosophy and physicalist epistemology had been declared failures. He directly abandoned attempts to explore time in the external world. Not just time. Kant declared we never recognize things' true faces. Humans can only know the phenomena of things as they appear to us. You can only see what your glasses tell you. This is the limit of human cognitive capacity, though we cannot know things in themselves. Kant simply built human knowledge of the world around phenomena. Things in themselves are unknowable. So humans just know what they can know. We'll see this division between phenomenal and noumenal realms further evolve into a division of humanity's two modes of existence. Kant's internalization of time exceeded Augustine's in both depth and breadth. Evident in the enormous agency he granted the subject, Kant inverted the traditional subject-object relationship. Instead of having the subject conform to the object, with both framed by external time, he had the object conform to the subject, letting the subject frame the object with its internal time. Kant inherited Augustine's formulation that present time is immediate sensation, placing time within sensation as humanity's a priori intuition. Like some kind of pre-installed operating system, Kant believed time and space are humanity's a priori forms of intuition. When we see form, we might reflexively think of formalism, considering it superficial and low. But in Western philosophy, form also means structure and norm. So what are a priori forms of intuition? They're blueprints we naturally follow when directly perceiving and observing things with our senses. Space is the blueprint for external sense, because human recognition of external things necessarily unfolds and arranges them according to spatial logic. Think about whether this is true. Time is the blueprint for internal sense. Human psychological activity follows not spatial logic but temporal logic. Our internal stream of consciousness is fundamentally a stream of time, and all external phenomena must ultimately be examined within consciousness. So time is simultaneously the blueprint for perceiving both internal and external phenomena. Once again, time is superior to space. We need to emphasize again why, in Kant, time cannot be found in the external world. This first stems from the collapse of the traditional cognitive mode, where humans and world are mutually external. If the world is external to me, I can at best recognize only phenomena, never essence. Kant's operation was precisely to reconstruct this internality. Truth is not external, nor is the world external. He just placed this internality on the subject's side. So Kant fundamentally denied our possibility of knowing things in themselves. What's knowable is only our own cognitive capacity, how we apply this capacity to things, thereby forming phenomena, concepts, knowledge. The objectivity of material objects is internal to our perception of them. So, if time is something perceivable, can necessarily only exist within the subject. Of course, Kant's model received plenty of criticism. For instance, Hegel said this is just thought playing games inside thought, with no interest in the matter itself, retreating into one's own little tower. Because Hegel held that truth's internality should lie in the world as a whole. Truth is totality. But that's all another story. However, if we restrict time to 1790, Kant was undoubtedly the person who most profoundly recognized the deep opposition between physical time and freedom. Because all human existence is meaningless before time is physical flow. Your entire life will remember you after 100 years. Even if you're an unparalleled hero, what about in 10,000 years? 100 million years? The ancients' fantasies of immortality and obsession with historical legacy were nothing but attempts to extend their existence as much as possible before cruel time. To resist time's destructive power, Kant's general approach was still the ancient Greek method: divide the world in two. This is the phenomenal realm and noumenal realm. Time is no longer an external physical flow, but the blueprint of the mind perceiving phenomena, strictly limited to the phenomenal realm. This reserved space for free will in the noumenal realm. And don't forget, humans themselves are also a kind of thing. Humans are divided into phenomenal and noumenal existence. Humans as phenomenal beings belong to temporal existence, while humans as noumenal beings are free existence. In Kant's view, freedom means self-legislation, moral autonomy. Thus, in practical reason to defend morality, he had to posit immortal souls and eternal God. at least all morality, become meaningless under time's torrent. This is Kant's greatest problem. He always faces internal tension, and his way of reconciling this tension can only be infinite division. Humans are divided into two kinds of existence in two worlds, so this human is no longer a living, real person. Of course, in Kantian philosophy, time has another extremely important but often overlooked role. Transcendental schema mediating between the pure categories of understanding and sensible empirical intuition, but limited by length and duration. I can't explain this here. This is physical time's constraint on freedom. In previous sections, we basically alternated between physical time and philosophical time, but with Einstein, the situation must change somewhat. Einstein, they say, had thoroughly read the Critique of Pure Reason by age 13 or 14, loved Schopenhauer throughout his life, hung his portrait in his study, and said the influences of Hume, Mach, Spinoza, Kant, and others ran quite deep. While frequently organizing group attacks on Hegel, we can say that without the philosophy concerning relativity, there would be no relativity. Moreover, Einstein was a rare physicist whose theory preceded experiment. Usually experiments produce phenomena that existing theory cannot explain. Then theoretical scholars swarm in, displaying their skills in the gaps left by experiment. But Einstein, almost single-handedly and through thought alone, demolished Newtonian spacetime, so far ahead of his time that the Nobel Prize didn't dare award him for relativity. In my view, the most miraculous thing in Einstein's theory is not time, nor the cosmos, but light. That formula we all learned, E equals mc squared. Einstein used this formula to prove that energy and mass are fundamentally the same thing, because they can be transformed into each other through this formula. What mediates between mass and energy? The speed of light. Miraculously, what mediates between time and space is still the speed of light. The famous Maxwell equations specify light's velocity, which we generally abbreviate as 300,000 kilometers per second, and miraculously, this velocity is independent of any reference frame. This means that no matter how we measure, no matter how we move relative to light, as long as light can propagate normally, it maintains this velocity. The speed of light in vacuum breaks the principle of relativity, becoming an absolute thing pervading everything. Let's now look at a seemingly quite ordinary concept called the light year. See how it will overturn our understanding. A light year is the distance light travels in 1 year of time, meaning that using light speed as medium, we can express spatial distance through temporal distance. Conversely, we can also use spatial distance to represent temporal distance. For example, imitating the light year, we can make a light mile, and easily calculate its length as 0.000054 seconds. Being mutually convertible means you can easily unify time and space in one equation. In previous sections, we could always only discuss time and space separately, then put them together to summarize. This is also classical physics approach. For example, this case, Zhang-sun departs at 3 p.m., driving at 30 kilometers per hour in a northeast direction, and has a traffic accident after 3 hours. Classical physics describing this event would first construct a three-dimensional coordinate system, using the x-axis and y-axis to describe the northeast direction, the z-axis to describe terrain, elevation changes, then separately pull out a time axis to calculate time. This actually implies time and space are two mutually independent things. But Einstein's model is a four-dimensional space-time coordinate system. He added the time axis in, because using light speed as the transformation factor, time and space can be expressed in the same units. For instance, a 15-minute time interval becomes an 800 billion light-foot spatial interval. We can easily convert between light inches, light feet, light miles, and light seconds, light minutes, light years. This actually eliminates all distinction between space and time. So Einstein's method of handling Zhang-san's traffic accident case isn't to separately calculate time interval and spatial interval, but to directly calculate the event interval in the four-dimensional coordinate system. We learned in high school how to apply the Pythagorean theorem to find distance in three-dimensional space. Now it's just one more dimension. Nothing complicated. We just take the sum of squares of the three spatial coordinates minus the square of the time coordinate, then take the square root. We get the four-dimensional distance between two events. We can already see Einstein's transcendence of Newton lies fundamentally not in empirical science's progress, but in the leap of underlying thinking mode. Physical events' distance in four-dimensional spacetime is actually more fundamental than time interval and spatial interval separately. They should be examined together. Next, we come to a discovery in special relativity that's even more mind-shattering. Imagine when you observe some object, like a stationary car, using you as reference. This car is at rest, meaning not traversing space. But Einstein says this car still has one motion, traversing time. Now, If this car starts up and drives away, part of its motion through time converts to motion through space. At this point, we get that famous principle. Relative to a stationary observer, the moving car and driver experience time flowing a bit slower, because time converted to space. Einstein tells us it's fundamentally not two independent motions separately traversing time and space. They were from the start, the same combined motion in four-dimensional spacetime. It's just that we habitually take them separately. Most brilliant is that special relativity also provides a universally applicable principle. Any object's combined velocity traversing space and traversing time always precisely equals the speed of light. On this basis, we can easily understand time dilation, length contraction, and very many other physical phenomena. We can even provide an explanation for traveling back to the past. For light itself, its velocity traversing space is light speed, so its velocity traversing time is zero. That is, for light, time doesn't move. So suppose we possessed energy greater than infinity, thereby accelerating our velocity through space to exceed light speed. Then our velocity through time would become negative. This is returning to the past. Light speed appears again. This is all too concise, too elegant, too beautiful, too profound. We don't know whether it's angel or devil, but it's undoubtedly the sovereign of special relativity. The first night I saw that principle, I was so excited I couldn't sleep at all, but I couldn't figure it out. Why? Why light speed again? Why does it always appear? What is its true identity? Just as earlier, I couldn't figure out why pi appears in so many mathematical expressions seemingly unrelated to circles. Because the truth of the circle is calculus. So the question is, what is the truth of light? In the history of philosophy, light is perhaps the most important image, including in the philosophical thinking unfolded in mythological form by various peoples. Light has prominent or even primordial status, from Plato's cave shadows to Descartes' natural light. The relationship between light and being is the relationship between epistemology and ontology. Namely, what is truly real, and how can I know objective reality? Levinas pointed out that due to light's existence, the world is given to us, can be comprehended. Light's peculiarity is that while existing itself, it also reveals other existences, providing evidence for other existences' existence. Imagine if something's existence had no evidence. On what basis could we say it exists? As for knowledge, it's nothing but the result of placing existence under reason's light, making it appear in orderly fashion. Einstein's philosophical background was actually quite mixed. To sort through the genealogy of figures would probably fill half a regiment. We can only say broadly that Einstein was greatly influenced by sensory empiricism, Kant, and Schopenhauer. When his thinking delved to the philosophical level, he had to answer for himself. What is real, and how can we know it? Einstein divided physical reality into ontological reality and theoretical reality. Ontological reality is what he called the external world, physical world, objective world. In terms of its externality, this is Kant's thing in itself. Theoretical reality is conceptualized reality. In Newton, this is mass points. Faraday and Maxwell, its fields. In special relativity, it's the intersection of world lines, namely events. General relativity, it's reality having cancelled all independence of spacetime coordinates. Physicists can use these to construct various world images, thereby grasping ontological reality through speculation and intuition. For instance, human brains actually cannot perceive high-dimensional space, but some geniuses can grasp it through mathematical thinking. Thus, this thing in itself becomes a thing in itself that can in some sense be grasped through pure speculation. But Einstein would agree with Kant that our knowledge of the world must be built on material provided by the senses. And among human senses, the cooperation of vision and light is undoubtedly most advantageous. In other words, this is also humanity's cognitive limit. Can you perceive something faster than light? What means do you have to perceive it? It's like wanting to measure something's size, but it's much smaller than the smallest graduation on your most precise instrument. How do you measure? So beyond light, humanity knows nothing. For each reference frame, its range of receiving and sending light is its entire universe belonging to it alone. Inside the light cone is fate. So the actual situation of light speed being unsurpassable, just that subluminal objects cannot accelerate to exceed light speed. As for things already superluminal, well, you go ahead and continue. And even if you do, we won't know. Light only has sovereignty over subjects within its own territory. Light is the medium and boundary between us and that real world we can never touch. It is messenger, destiny, sovereign. It is the combination of Hermes, the Fates, and Zeus. Under light's absolute rule, all reference frames are equal. This is relativity's most well-known transcendence of Newtonian spacetime. Newton's theological background made him firmly believe different perspective statuses could never be equal. Some perspective must be closer to truth than others. But relativity points out that each of our reference frames is equally real. Perhaps this is because we partake of the same light. In the final section of this chapter, let's return to the red bucket. Newton borrowed from the civil engineering brother to clarify Einstein's absolute spacetime. You heard right. Einstein didn't choose relative spacetime by opposing Newton, but found a new absolute fulcrum for it in Newton's void bucket. The bucket undoubtedly can only rotate relative to absolute space. 200 years later, the relativist Mach, who importantly influenced Einstein, believed that in true void, motion and rest are completely equivalent. Discussing the bucket's rotation is meaningless. Special relativity holds that the bucket moves relative to absolute spacetime, not Newton's three-dimensional space, but four-dimensional absolute spacetime. I hope you still remember the four-dimensional spacetime model unified by light speed. We know that for different observers, an object can have different states of motion, but all observers will agree on the geometric shape of that object's motion trajectory. This is independent of reference frame. So an object's motion trajectory in spacetime coordinates is likewise. Imagine an object's trajectory traversing spacetime is a straight line, logically speaking. If we reduce dimensions, this object's trajectories separately traversing time and space should also be straight lines. Otherwise, they couldn't combine to form a straight line. Since both time and space trajectories are straight lines, middle school knowledge tells us the object isn't accelerating. Moreover, middle school knowledge also tells us rest and uniform rectilinear motion are equivalent. So, when everyday thinking asks whether an object is moving, it's actually asking whether this object is accelerating, because only accelerated motion is distinguishable. At this point, we have an absolute standard to judge whether an object is moving. Look at whether that object's space-time trajectory is a straight line. If it's curved, then it's definitely moving, because only the straight line case is non-accelerating. Until the end of this chapter, we're actually still in special relativity. General relativity hasn't even begun. Even without Einstein, special relativity would have been proposed. For example, the Lorentz transformation was just one step away from special relativity. Poincaré almost independently wrote out the formulas of special relativity. And Minkowski, widely known for the line "Einstein is poor at mathematics," also had preliminary thoughts on relativity. As for general relativity, it was almost entirely Einstein's independently created miracle. I hope we have the opportunity to discuss this. As an outsider, I want to use one sentence to summarize this chapter. The truth of spacetime is light, and the truth of light is light itself, and also every person who sees the light. First, thank you all very much for watching to this point. This is the highest praise for this video. This final section discusses two more philosophers who radically reimagined time. In an era when the 19th century's shadow hadn't yet receded and the 20th century's history had yet to unfold, time was raised as a question of life philosophy. Life philosophy was direct resistance against established physical laws, especially mechanical laws' domination of everything. This mechanical materialism attempted to directly explain life activities using mechanical laws, because matter was viewed as rigidly inert and motion merely displacement. But a series of discoveries represented by radioactive elements blasted holes in science from within. Life philosophers saw the bankruptcy of mechanical naturalism, the bankruptcy of measuring life activities through empirical and rational methods. It should be noted that natural science loves saying, "I have concrete research objects," thereby drawing boundaries for itself. This pretense of humility is actually the greatest arrogance, because it immediately treats everything science doesn't study as non-existent. What cannot be consumed by mechanism and reductionism gets dismissed with the hats of pseudoscience and mysticism. Kant first saw that what humans recognize is always the aspect reason wants to take from things, while aspects beyond reason's capacity are disregarded. And science cannot exist independently of philosophy. Science, with this mindset, simply uses various philosophies unreflectively as its premises, like Lorentz's insistence on ether, or even Einstein's cosmological constant. Weren't these also based on philosophical convictions? Back to the point. The founder of life philosophy was Dilthey, who advocated that spiritual activity has independence relative to physical facts. The sciences of spirit differ from natural sciences fundamentally in method from the start. Bergson was life philosophy's great synthesizer. His philosophy is perhaps the theoretical foundation for understanding 20th century French philosophy. We can say without Bergson, there would be no French existentialism, and his influence extended to Deleuze. In 1927, he won the Nobel Prize for the philosophical work Creative Evolution. From the name, we know this book benefited from Darwin's thought. Why can matter evolve into life? How does life step by step evolve into humans? The answer is matter's infinite self-creation. Otherwise, we cannot explain the essential difference between matter and life. We can say Bergson's purpose was a situation of universal suffocation. How can we stimulate life's internal creative force? Whether the suffocation comes from a mechanical cosmos or philosophical concepts. How do we liberate time from that mechanical, quantified, homogeneously suffocating view of time? How do we stimulate time's creative power and possibility with qualitative richness, thereby activating our living existence? This is this section's theme. If we must position Bergson's philosophy in one sentence, it's an intuitionist and vitalist philosophy of consciousness. Intuitionism holds that intuition can directly reach reality without going through experience, intellect, and concepts. In Bergson's view, if something lacks immediacy, it simply isn't real, much less active. No conceptual games. Real things must present themselves to us vividly in intuition. So Bergson naturally disliked Hegel because Hegel most emphasized concepts' mediating role, believing we grasp time through concepts' self-transcendence. Bergson thought this was merely intellect showing off, leading only to an empty, contentless conceptual dictionary. Vitalism has been explained before, as for philosophy of consciousness. This is relative to another intuitive tradition in France, conceptual philosophy, which emerged later. For Bergson, time's essence is duration. It's the manifestation form of consciousness flow and life flow, a constantly renewing creation and evolution. This makes it completely different from space and spatialized time. The latter is a completely homogeneous continuous sequence. When people represent it mathematically in purely quantitative ways, it actually lacks depth. But the advantage of viewing time this way is we can subject time to our management, facilitate our planning and action, trade of eliminating content for certainty. But Bergson's temporal duration doesn't serve thought's usefulness, but focuses on life's immediate relevance. For instance, parents love asking, what use is playing games? The Bergsonian answer would be, at least during game time, my time belongs to myself. I can confirm my own living existence. Duration time is lively. Each of its moments is in qualitative flux and cannot be measured. Each moment interpenetrates and fuses with others, forming an indivisible whole. Since duration is pure becoming, never a frozen fixed thing, it completely escapes dependence on space and pure mathematical expression. It's infinite present progressive tense, infinite generation and creation. Space and spatialized time are quantifiable extension, while duration time is unquantifiable intensity. We've said many times before that traditional philosophy likes viewing eternally unchanging things as substance, while changeable things will sooner or later perish. Then proclaims seeking truth in the realm of forms. Bergson inverts them, advocating plunging into that living life flow. That's what's truly real, not empty contentless concepts. In Bergson's world picture, life flow is reality, spirit is life flow's upward thrust, while matter is life flow's downward sinking and solidification. This point, living nature is also counted as life. Finally, we must discuss freedom. Bergson's freedom isn't freedom of autonomous choice but fundamental, original freedom. Since temporal duration is constant creation and renewal, time is forever open to new possibilities. The past never becomes reason to bind the present. Constantly arising possibilities become the force-dissolving, deterministic views of time. Unless your shackles are yourself, life, time, and duration, necessarily mean freedom. Earlier we said that within French philosophy, besides Bergson's consciousness philosophy tradition, there's the conceptual philosophy tradition. Its representative Bachelard conducted diametrically opposed critique of Bergson. Bachelard believed time can only be instantaneous and broken. Real time exists entirely in actuality, action, and the present. Temporal duration is merely an illusion. In intellectual history, there's no continuous progress, only eternal mutual correction between experience and reason. Time and history aren't continuous but full of ruptures, leaps, and nodes. This view of time perhaps provided windows for organizing action subjects to intervene in history's ruptures. Besides this, Einstein also had years of debate with Bergson. But basically, they talked past each other. Quite boring. Bergson's influence didn't stop at France. Heidegger's being influenced by him should be documentable. We can say Bergson prepared conditions for German philosophy's transition, from strictly precise Husserlian philosophy toward existential Heideggerian philosophy. We know that for great philosophers, their thoughts' profundity and rigor often come at the cost of incomprehensibility. To reduce difficulty of understanding, we must, to some extent, sacrifice this profundity and rigor. I call it the impossible triangle. This applies especially to Heidegger. His obscurity throughout philosophy's history, probably only his teacher Husserl could rival. Note that Heidegger is famous for poetic philosophy. He never planned to digest his philosophy through speculation, but emphasized a kind of calling. In this section, if everyone abandons the obsession with understanding, the experience should be much better. For Heidegger, time shouldn't remain an epistemological question, but as an existential question. Previously, everyone asked what time is too much. Now, Heidegger asks, what meaning does time have for my being in the world? Heidegger answered, time's truth is temporality. Time is temporality's manifestation. Heidegger's term is Zeitigung temporalizing, speaking of certain timing, opportunity, whose existence has internal connection with time, temporality. However, it manifests, maintains a general designation of possible existence. Exists, but it's definitely not some ready-made thing. Only manifests existence's meaning through time. If we view time as ready-made, it actually belongs to the fallen and everyday condition. Because in physical time, fallenness, namely time's meaninglessness, is the basic fact of the subject's life. As for how we concernfully face the future to project our lives. That doesn't become a philosophical question at all. Human being in the world is essentially a standing out ecstasis. It's the process of constantly opening oneself. Humans are Dasein, being there, being in the world, existing together with all worldly things. Dasein's process of leaving its own being and entering the material world. The history temporality stands out toward the future, having been and present. Because temporality is inherently Dasein's dynamic, future-oriented historical activity process, original, self-sufficient, self-transcending trajectory. We don't enclose ourselves in time. Since we're existing, we're always open to things. We maintain this openness, namely forever open to future possibilities. Thus, Heidegger makes that traditional dried-up dead time come alive, giving it history's dynamism and existential content, even making time truly permeate world's constitution. Of course, Bergson's richly flowing duration time is also comprehended by Heidegger. Time naturally cannot be that past causal chain linking tightly, but each individual historically creating their own existence, making life their own work, to actually realize that vigorous life force of myriad things bursting forth. Finally, original time also has its end. The past has already died. The present is dying. Human Dasein is mortal. We must awaken in the process facing death. Because death is precisely this most authentic possibility. Essentially, time's constant process toward itself is time's dissolution and annihilation. Here, time is gone, past, present, future, all gone. This is time's nullification, also world's nullification. If this isn't a boundless, limitless nirvana, I truly don't know what it is. In the final bit of space, I still want to discuss Marx's time. Least everyone can understand this. In university, I read a dialogue collection by Zhang Yibing of Nanjing University called Marx, Who Illuminates the World. In it, teacher Zhang dialogues with David Harvey, analyzing the concept of labor while extensively discussing Newtonian spacetime relativity and quantum mechanics. I was greatly shocked. I recommend everyone read it too. Earlier, when I studied high school politics, learning that value is determined by socially necessary labor time, I instinctively felt something was off. Because at that time, I still viewed time as purely a physical quantity, couldn't figure out how it could have such important function in political economy. Time must have deeper meaning. Until I saw this sentence in my teacher's Collected Works, Volume 47, analyzing communist institutions. Time is actually humanity's active existence. It's not only the measure of human life, but also the space of human development. I believe this is actually the theoretical premise for understanding commodity value.